This is the Life by Design with Angela Weiss podcast, episode 53, The Voice You Hear After They Leave, How Critical People Can Become Your Inner Critic. Welcome back. I'm Angela Weiss, a dual board certified nurse practitioner and author, and I'm so glad that you're here. Whether you're listening on your morning commute, taking a walk, or sitting on your porch with a cup of coffee like me, or simply taking a few minutes to yourself, thank you for allowing me to be part of your day. I want to begin today's episode with a question. Have you ever noticed how easy it is to remember the hurtful things people have said to you, yet how difficult it can be to remember all the good things that have been told to you? You can receive compliments for years. People will tell you you're kind and compassionate, intelligent, hardworking, or a wonderful parent. You appreciate those words, maybe even smile in the moment, but then life goes on. And then one day someone says something hurtful. One criticism, one accusation, one sentence, and somehow that's the one your mind decides to replay over and over again. Maybe someone called you selfish. Maybe they told you you were lazy or too emotional or too sensitive, too needy, or simply too much. Or maybe they never actually said those exact words, but their actions left you believing just how much they thought of you, or lack of. As a nurse practitioner, I see this every single day. People don't just come into my office carrying symptoms of anxiety or depression. They come in carrying words spoken years ago that somehow still have the power to influence how they see themselves today. And before we go any further, I want to tell you this. Just because someone spoke something over you does not make it true. That's their opinion or their words in the moment. Today's episode isn't about pretending those words didn't hurt. They probably did. Instead, it's about understanding why they hurt, why our brains hold on to them, and how we can begin replacing those messages with something healthier, more balanced, and ultimately more truthful. One of the questions I hear most often from patients is, why can't I just let it go? If you've ever asked yourself that question, I hope you'll give yourself some grace. Your brain isn't trying to make your life difficult. It's actually doing exactly what it was designed to do. Our brains were created for survival, not happiness. Thousands of years ago, survival depended on remembering danger. If something threatened us, our brains stored that information so we could recognize it and avoid it in the future. That same survival system is still operating today. The difference is that instead of remembering dangerous animals or unsafe environments, our brains are often treating emotional pain as something that also needs to be remembered. Psychologists call this negativity bias. And negativity bias is our brain's tendency to notice, remember, and give greater weight to negative experience than positive ones. Think about your own life. If 10 people compliment you today and one person criticizes you, which comment are you most likely to think about tonight? For most of us, it's the criticism. And it's not because it's more accurate or not because it's more important, but because your brain has flagged it as something that might help protect you from being hurt again. Understanding that can be incredibly freeing because it reminds us that our brains aren't always telling us the truth. They're often telling us what they think will keep us safe. There's another fascinating piece to this that I think is important to understand. Research has shown that emotional pain activates many of the same areas of the brain that process physical pain. That's why rejection hurts. And that's why betrayal hurts. That's why being excluded hurts. And that's why words can have wounds that last for years. We've all heard the saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. It sounds good, but it simply isn't true. Words do matter. They shape relationships. They influence confidence. They affect how we see ourselves. And over time, they can become part of our identity if we're not careful. That brings us to something psychologists refer to as core beliefs. Core beliefs are deeply rooted assumptions we develop about ourselves, other people, and the world around us. They're usually formed very early in life, often developing from repeated experiences rather than one isolated event. Think of them as the lens through which you interpret everything that happens. If your core belief is, I'm capable, you'll probably see challenges as opportunities to learn. If your core belief is, I'm not good enough, you'll often interpret setbacks as proof that you've failed. The event may be exactly the same, but the interpretation is completely different. So where do these beliefs come from? Sometimes they come from our families. A child who repeatedly hears, why can't you ever do anything right, may eventually stop hearing the parent's voice and start hearing their own. Sometimes they come from school. A teacher embarrasses a student in front of the class. Boy, I remember that from my elementary school. Peers tease them because of the way they look, talk, or learn. Sometimes they come from relationships. Maybe someone repeatedly criticized your appearance, your personality, or your dreams until you slowly stopped believing in yourself. And sometimes they come from experiences rather than words. Being ignored, being abandoned, feeling like you had to earn love by performing, achieving, or taking care of someone else. Here's what's important to understand. Children don't usually question adults. They don't think, maybe my parent is stressed. They don't think, maybe my teacher's having a bad day. Instead, they internalize that message and they think, it must be me. That's how unhealthy core beliefs begin. Over time, those beliefs start creating what we call automatic thoughts. Automatic thoughts are exactly what they sound like. They happen so quickly that we often don't even realize they're there. Someone doesn't return your text, they must be upset with me. You make a mistake at work, I'm terrible at my job. A friend cancels dinner, they probably don't even want to be my friend anymore. Notice what happened. Nothing in those situations actually proved those conclusions. Your brain just filled in the blanks. And here's the important part. Automatic doesn't mean accurate. We have thousands of thoughts every single day. Some are helpful, some are true, some aren't either of those things. One of the most empowering skills you can develop is learning to pause long enough to ask yourself, is this thought actually true or just familiar? Because familiar thoughts often feel true simply because we've practiced them for years. Now let's talk about something called cognitive distortions. That sounds like a complicated psychological term, but it's really describing something every one of us does from time to time. Cognitive distortions are thinking patterns that twist reality. For example, maybe you make one mistake at work and immediately think, I always mess everything up. That's called all or nothing thinking. Or maybe someone gives you constructive feedback and your mind immediately jumps to, they're going to fire me. That's catastrophizing. Maybe a friend walks past you without saying hello and immediately you think, they must be angry with me. That's called mind reading because you've convinced yourself you know what someone else is thinking without any actual evidence. Or maybe you feel anxious before giving a presentation and conclude, if I feel this nervous, I must not be prepared. That's emotional reasoning, believing that because you feel something, it must be true. Here is why all of this matters. If you never question these thoughts, they begin reinforcing those unhealthy core beliefs. And then something even more interesting begins to happen. Your brain starts looking for evidence that supports what it already believes. This is called confirmation bias. Let's say somewhere along the way you developed the belief, I'm a failure. Now imagine you have 10 successes this month and one setback. Which one do you think your brain focuses on? The setback. And it's not because the setback defines you, but it's because it fits the story your brain already believes. Your mind begins collecting evidence that supports the belief while quietly ignoring evidence that it doesn't. It's almost like your brain has become a detective trying to prove itself right. And that's why people can accomplish incredible things and still believe they're not enough. They dismiss compliments, they minimize achievements, they explain away success, but every criticism, every mistake, every rejection, those get added to the file labeled, see, I knew I wasn't enough. The truth is our brains are incredible storytellers. Liars. The question is whether the story they're telling us is actually accurate. One of the things I tell my patients all the time is, you don't have to believe every thought that you think. Sometimes I have to tell myself that too. Just because a thought enters your mind doesn't mean it deserves a permanent place there. Think about that for a moment. If someone walked into your home and started criticizing everything about you, eventually you would ask them to leave. Yet so many of us allow our inner critic to move in permanently. It follows us to work. It rides with us in the car. It sits beside us at dinner. It even keeps us company in the middle of the night when we can't sleep. And after many years of listening to it, we stop recognizing it as a critic. We mistake it for the truth. So, how do we begin changing that? The first step is awareness. You don't change something you don't notice. For the next few days, I want you to just become curious about the thoughts that you have. Pay attention to how you speak to yourself. When something goes wrong, what's the first thing your mind says? I always mess everything up. I'm so stupid. I will never get this right. No wonder people leave. I should have known better. Notice the language. Notice how absolute it is. Words like always, never, everyone, and no one are clues that your inner critic may be speaking louder than what's true, what's reality. The second step is learning to question those thoughts, not argue with them, not shame yourself for having them, just question them. Ask yourself, what evidence supports this thought that I'm having? What evidence doesn't support it? If my best friend came to me with the exact thought, what would I tell them? That's one of my favorite questions because we are often incredibly compassionate with other people while being unbelievably harsh with ourselves. If your best friend made one mistake at work, would you tell them they were a complete failure? Of course not. You'd remind them of all the things they've done well. You'd encourage them. You'd help them see the bigger picture. So why don't we offer ourselves that same kindness? The third step is replacing criticism with something more balanced. Notice I didn't say replace it with blind positivity. That isn't about standing in front of the mirror saying everything is wonderful if you don't believe it. Our brains usually reject statements that feel completely unrealistic. Instead, we're aiming for balance. For example, instead of saying I'm a terrible parent, try asking yourself, did I make a mistake today? Maybe. Does one mistake define my entire ability to love and care for my child? Absolutely not. Instead of I always fail, try I failed at some things and I've succeeded at many others. Instead of nobody likes me, try I'm feeling lonely right now. But feelings aren't always facts. Do you hear the difference? Balanced thoughts leave room for truth. The inner critic speaks in absolutes. Compassion speaks with perspective. Another strategy I often recommend is to ask yourself, whose voice is this? Sometimes the answer surprises people. Maybe a parent, a teacher, an ex-spouse, a coach, a sibling, someone who made you believe that love had to be earned or that perfection was the only acceptable standard. Once you recognize whose voice it is, you can begin separating it from your own. Because just because you heard it repeatedly doesn't mean it belongs to you or in your head. One of my favorite analogies is to think of your thoughts like cars driving down a highway. You don't have to jump into every car that passes by. Some thoughts deserve your attention. Others, they should just simply keep driving right by. The problem is that many of us have spent years climbing into every negative thought that comes along. We ride with it for hours, sometimes days, sometimes decades. Learning to let a thought pass without attaching it to us is one of the most powerful skills you can develop, and that takes practice. Healing almost always does. There's another concept I want to introduce because I think it gives people so much hope. It's called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change throughout your life. For years, scientists believed the brain was essentially fixed after childhood. We now know that that's not true. Your brain is constantly building new connections based on what you repeatedly think, practice, and experience. Every time you interrupt a self-critical thought, every time you challenge an unhealthy belief, and every time you choose self-compassion instead of self-condemnation, you're strengthening a different pathway in your brain. You're literally teaching your brain a new way of thinking. That doesn't mean that the old pathway disappears immediately. If you've walked the same trail through the woods for 20 years, it's going to be well worn. Creating a new trail takes time. At first, it feels awkward and unnatural, and you may find yourself slipping back into the old path. And that's okay. Healing isn't about perfection. It's about repetition. The more often you choose the healthier path, the stronger it becomes. And eventually, what once felt unnatural begins to feel normal. That's one of the most helpful things I can tell you today. You're not stuck with the way you've always thought about yourself. Your story isn't over, and your brain can learn. Your perspective can change, and your inner voice can be one that encourages you instead of constantly tearing you down. As we begin wrapping up today's episode, I want to leave you with one final thought. Imagine carrying around a backpack every day. Now imagine that every hurtful comment someone ever made about you became a rock that you placed inside that backpack. You're not good enough. You'll never succeed. You're too sensitive. You're selfish. Nobody's ever going to love you. You always mess everything up. At first, one rock doesn't seem too heavy, but after years of adding more and more, you begin to wonder why you're so exhausted. The truth is, many people aren't just carrying the stress of today, they're carrying words from 10, 20, 30 years ago. Maybe 50 years ago. Your whole life. Maybe today is the day you begin taking some of those rocks out of your backpack and tossing them into the forest because, yeah, they happened, and they hurt, but you don't have to carry someone else's opinion anymore. That doesn't determine your self-worth. I also want to acknowledge something that's important. There are times when criticism is healthy. If someone lovingly points out that we've made a mistake or hurt someone, that's different than someone attacking our worth. Healthy feedback says you've made a mistake. Shame says you are the mistake. Healthy feedback helps us grow. Shame convinces us we can't grow. Learning to recognize that difference can completely change the way you receive the feedback. One invites growth, the other destroys confidence. And if you've lived with an inner critic for a long time, you may not even realize how harsh you've become toward yourself. Maybe today is simply an invitation to start paying attention, to notice your thoughts without immediately believing them, and to ask yourself whether you'd ever speak to someone else that you love the way that you speak to yourself. To begin offering yourself some compassion and patience and grace that you so freely give everyone else. Because here's something I've learned, both personally and professionally. People heal differently when they begin changing the way that they talk to themselves. Not because life suddenly becomes easier or because difficult things stop happening, but because they're no longer fighting themselves every step of the way. Healing isn't becoming someone completely different. It's becoming free from beliefs that were never yours to carry in the first place. So this week I want to leave you with a challenge. Pay attention to your inner voice. When you catch yourself saying something harsh, don't criticize yourself for having the thought. Just pause. Take a breath. Ask yourself, is this true? What evidence do I have to prove this to be true or not? What would I say to someone I love if they were thinking about themselves this way? Then choose one sentence that's more balanced. It doesn't have to be perfect or unrealistically positive. It just has to be honest. Instead of, I'm a failure, maybe it's, I'm learning. Instead of, I'll never get this right, maybe this is hard, but I'm growing. Instead of, I'm not enough, maybe it's, my worth isn't determined by one mistake, one opinion, or one difficult season. Small changes repeated consistently create lasting change. Remember, your brain believes what it hears the most. So if you spent years listening to your inner critic, don't be discouraged that it takes time to build a kinder voice. Healing isn't measured by never having negative thoughts again. Healing is noticing them sooner, believing them less, and replacing them more often with kinder, gentler words. And little by little, that new voice becomes stronger than the old one. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. I never take for granted that you choose to spend part of your week here with me. My hope is that this episode gives you practical tools, evidence-based education, and a little more hope than you had before you pressed play. If today's episode encouraged you, would you do me a favor and just subscribe, like, follow, leave a comment, share this episode with someone who may need to hear it. You may never know whose life could be impacted by one conversation. I also want to say I have some books on Amazon about how we speak to ourselves. Always Never. The most toxic relationship I ever had was with myself, and You Wouldn't Talk to Your Daughter That Way is another one, just about that inner critic. You can find those on Amazon with many more. If you'd like, you can follow me on Instagram at Angela Weiss Author, Facebook at Life by Design Press, LinkedIn, Angela Weiss, and I'll put my author's website on Tertulia in the show notes that has a list of all the books that I have. Remember that this podcast is for educational purposes only, and it does not replace a relationship with your primary care provider, therapist, psychiatrist, whoever, okay? It also doesn't form a relationship with me in the sense of taking place of those people. If you're feeling like you're in a crisis and you're in Canada or the US, please call 911 or text 988, the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. Thank you again so much for being here. I do these episodes Sundays, Tuesdays, Thursdays. Sometimes I miss one because life happens. Have a great day.